Abandon all prejudices, all ye who enter here. Park your paradigms, perk up your ears, and open your mind as we now shine the laser light of reason on the topic of jealousy versus envy. Hi, I'm David Bolton, and welcome to the Path of Socrates. Well, I can tell you, my friends, that when I woke up today, I thought about something and it just absolutely delighted me. I was really happy because I realized that one of the terrible vices of humanity has, at least in the English-speaking worlds, all but disappeared. Can you imagine that? One of the vices that has tortured people and burdened people for thousands of years is all but non-existent. And that vice is envy. Let me ask you this. When was the last time you said, upon hearing, for example, that a friend of yours got a new car or found a new wonderful girlfriend or won the lottery, when was the last time you said, "Oh, I'm so envious"? You're thinking, aren't you? Well, you should think, because I haven't heard that in a long time. What I hear is, "I'm so jealous." And all joking and sarcasm aside, this has peeved me for years. Why is it that so many English speakers cannot distinguish jealousy and envy? German speakers have no problem with that. We have Eifersucht, jealousy, and Neid, which is envy. In Spanish as well, we have celoso and we have envidia. But for some reason, the English language has become, dare I say it, so dumbed down that things are becoming simpler and simpler and simpler. Now you might say, well, David, that's a good thing. Why should we have so many vocabulary words that it just burdens our minds? Why can't we just simplify everything? Well, I read a study years ago, and it said that little children who learn a lot of vocabulary generally develop higher IQs, when you're still very young, in the phase where your IQ is still developing. Why is that? Well, because to think precisely and clearly, it helps to have many different words. One good example is color. Now here I'm going to put myself down, because if you know me at all, you know that I don't just criticize others where I think it's necessary. I criticize myself as well. This is maybe the key to any kind of self-development, recognizing your own weaknesses. Now, in the area of color, if you ask me to name all the colors I know off the top of my head, okay, I'm going to say black and brown and white and green and yellow and pink and purple and violet, and I'll add a few more to that. But if you had asked my mother, God rest her soul, she would have given you a list several times as long. Why? Did she sit around memorizing names of colors in a dictionary? No, but she studied art. She was very good at art. And from the time she was a child, she could draw well. And later she went to the Maryland Institute and to perfect her skills. Her specialty was watercolor. And she knew all these different colors, the names of the colors. Now, of course, the human eye can distinguish hundreds of thousands of shades of color. And there's some colors we can't even see because they're, for example, in the ultraviolet range. Maybe bees can see them, but we humans can't. But the human can distinguish many types of color. And yet, if you don't know so many names of color, you aren't going to distinguish them. This is a very interesting phenomenon. Remember reading also about some experts that studied this phenomenon among different peoples, especially what we call primitive peoples, and throughout the ages. Some peoples didn't have names of a lot of colors that we distinguish. I believe I read that some ancient Greeks didn't distinguish between blue and green even. And yet all the primitive peoples did name the color red. Well, why is that? Well, maybe because red is the color of blood. If you see a friend of yours and he's just been attacked and he's bleeding, well, that's very important to realize if somebody's bleeding, right? Now you would think, well, maybe that's just limited to old ancient peoples, but no, it's not the case. Even more modern times, there have been tribes discovered that only had maybe 8 different names for colors. Well, even I could name more than that. My point here is, the more we distinguish, the more we take something into account that helps us distinguish further. And distinguishing is at the root of all conscious thinking. Remember that. Distinguishing is at the root of all conscious thinking. If you cannot distinguish, even at the point where you can't distinguish between yourself and your environment, for example, if you take some kind of drug and you just feel one with all the universe, well, you're not distinguishing anything. You might have a mystical experience that's beautiful and could be very valid, but your logical thinking processes are going to be very, very weak at that moment. So distinguishing is a good thing. Therefore, if we want our young people to develop further their intelligence, and we want ourselves to be able to develop our minds, it's good to distinguish. That's what the scientist does, right? It's extremely important for scientists to distinguish. Think about it. How many diseases are there? Hundreds? Suppose a scientist just said, well, you have some kind of germ. Well, doctor, what kind of germ is it? Malaria germ or syphilis germ? Oh, it's just a kind of germ. Well, that's not a very good physician, is it now? No, he must distinguish and say, you have this parasite that causes malaria and we have something to treat that. Or you have this kind of bug, whatever it is, COVID-19 or smallpox or whatever it is, right? Science is all about distinguishing one thing from another. And it's no coincidence that that science and logical thinking are connected for that reason. But now look what happens to language. I'll do a podcast about the subject of profanity at some future date. But you ever notice how some people cannot say a single sentence without throwing in the F word, even 2, 3, 4 times? In other words, the adjectives in our beautiful English language, many have all but fallen into total disuse. It's always F and this, F and that, and F and this. I don't understand it. Is this really, I mean, first of all, besides the fact that you could be offending people, maybe of religious sensitivities, I myself am no prude. I avoid saying such words in this podcast because I want this to be heard also by young people. I don't understand why some people, even when talking about serious subjects, and some very intelligent people, cannot speak without throwing in all kinds of F words and MF words and SH words and everything. It's not a sign of a higher consciousness, let's put it that way, if only because we should not speak in such a way that our words are going to offend others. Strangely, I find that if you say some words, if somebody dares say the N word, which no, I don't use, but then people get offended. People on the left especially, oh my God, you're a race, how can you say that? But then you go back to MF and F and everything, not considering the fact that maybe they're offending people too. This is not showing respect to people, and I think everybody should be shown respect. Credit here I will give not to myself and my own insight, but to my father. Once again, God rest his soul, or may he rest in peace, however you want to put that. He taught me that lesson as a child by example. My father never really preached. Boy, in this case, the apple fell very far from the tree. I hear some of you thinking. And I admit, mea culpa, okay, I'm somewhat of a preacher. And I can't help it. It's my nature. Well, my father wasn't like that, but he did teach us certain things just by example. And that was one of those things. We never said the N word in the house because he didn't, and he taught by example. And I think that's very important for people to teach their children by example. I have no children, but the ones that do, sometimes I see they're giving them bad examples, which is not so good. But one thing he taught us by example is respect. I never saw my father treat people really differently based on their social status. We lived in what could be called a poor neighborhood. I mean, okay, think Baltimore ghetto. Being honest, that's basically what it was. And I don't regret having lived there. It was a terrible environment, a whole lot of crime and everything. But I had a lot of good friends, black and white, and from the very beginning I learned that you judge people by the quality of their character and not by the color of their skin. And I remember my father, if he saw some poor guy in the street, he might give him $1 for a sandwich or whatever, even the guy didn't ask for it. Or if you got in a conversation with somebody, it didn't matter if the guy was some drunk from the street or some high-powered lawyer. My father treated them the same, and that was with friendliness and with courtesy. Unless they got in his face and crossed him, and then he could be scary. And I don't care who you were. He would not tolerate a lack of respect or any kind of attacks or whatever. He would not tolerate that. But if you treated him well, he would always treat people with kindness and respect. And I think that's a good model to follow. And I personally don't understand why more people don't do that, because it's simply a good thing to do. But to get back now to our color, and remember, I said in my first talk about conspiracy theories that I speak in a sort of stream of consciousness way. One could say I kind of deviate from the theme at times, but no, it is all connected. You'd be surprised at how many things are connected in life, things that don't seem connected. Getting back to color, I cannot distinguish all that many colors. No, I'm not colorblind. But some people can distinguish many, many types of color. And I think in language is important too. To expand your vocabulary, and I don't mean learning lists of vocabulary words, my God, how boring can that be? But if you learn a new word, use it. Now to get back to the main topic, which is jealousy versus envy, I'd like to explain to you the difference, because unfortunately, even speakers of English, even people who have gone through university, apparently don't know the difference, the great majority of them. And I don't quite understand. I remember my grandmother, boy, I'm talking about a lot of relatives now. Well, it's good to remember those in the past that have helped you in the way. She never went to college a day in her life, only finished high school. But she would not mistake jealousy from envy. Back then, they had a higher level of language consciousness, shall we say. Okay, what's the difference? Let me explain it to you, and it's not so difficult. A friend of yours wins the lottery, for example. And you say, oh, I'm so jealous. No, you're not jealous. You are envious. Envy refers to a feeling you get that you would like to have what somebody else has, but what you don't have. A friend of yours gets a hot new girlfriend. They say, I'm jealous. No, he could be jealous, but you're not jealous of him. You're envious of him because he has something you do not have, and yet something you want. Now, with jealousy, for example, you go to a party, you see a friend of yours, he has a hot new girlfriend, and you're feeling envy. Once again, not jealousy, because you don't have her. He has something you want, and you feel envy. Then she starts flirting with you with her eyes, right? And he notices that. Then he gets jealous. Why? Because jealousy is when you have something that you don't want to share with others. And if you notice you might lose it to somebody, then you feel jealous. To get back to the lottery example, a friend of yours wins a lottery, and you say, oh, I'm not jealous, I'm envious. In other words, boy, I wish that had happened to me. Now, when you come to him next day, oh, you won $1 million, could you maybe lend me $10,000? Then he could start feeling jealous. In other words, he has the money, but he doesn't want to share it. That is jealousy. He's afraid of losing it. Jealousy is when you're afraid of losing something that you already have. Now, that isn't so difficult, is it? Spanish people can distinguish those two concepts. Italian people can, French people can, Japanese people can, German people can. So why can't English speakers? Why has the language become so dumbed down? I'll get into this more deeply in a future talk. I think this is one of the downsides of democracy, as I call it. In other words, if you think of 17th century France, I'm sure a lot of you spend a lot of time thinking of 17th century France, but if you read history, you probably have. Back then, and I'm not saying things were perfect back then, oh, believe me, there are problems you can't even imagine that people had back then. Disease just being one of them. You think COVID-19 is bad? Let me tell you this, the average person in the 17th century, or 18th century, or 19th century, or 15th century, whatever, if they could come to the future and see the way we're reacting now to COVID-19, oh my God, put your mask on, they would think we're the I don't know what word to use that wouldn't offend people. They would think we're such weaklings and such despicable cowards that you wouldn't believe it. The diseases they faced back then, oh my God, should we start with smallpox? That wiped out so many people. Hey, how about the plague that killed, it would enter a town or a city, and by the time it left a few months later, 40% of people were dead, if not 50%. How about dysentery? How about typhoid fever? How about cholera? And all these things could come and go at any time, right? Okay, I won't get into the COVID thing, but if you read some history, you'll get a bit of perspective. Now, getting back to the 17th century in another respect, there was no democracy then. In England, they had the beginnings of democracy, yes. But talk about France here, for example. The king, his word was law, basically. Yes, they had a sort of parliament that was more like a legal body, but normally that wasn't called into effect. And if the king ordered something, that's what the people did, right? But also back then, in Versailles and in the royal court, that was high culture. You wouldn't believe the level of culture of literature, in dance, in music. King Louis XIV himself was an excellent, and I mean expert dancer, very highly cultured man. Now, I'm not painting a picture of perfection of Versailles. Things could be pretty primitive there too. For example, they didn't have enough latrines, bathrooms. So if people had to relieve themselves, they'd just find some curtains and go right behind the curtains. So the smells there in some of those halls were not very nice, right? But in any case, as far as other aspects of culture are concerned, they were very cultured, and the common people looking up to those figures would think, wow, why can't we have such nice clothes? Maybe you've seen some movies of 17th, 18th century, or you see some lower class people, but they're wearing clothes that look like imitation higher class clothes when they might be dirty and filthy and with holes in them, right? Because people would look up to the higher class, they want to imitate them. They might think, wow, why do they get to listen to this great composer's music with orchestras? We'd like to do that too, if only we had the money. These days, the irony is people listen to such music, even on YouTube, for free, and most people don't do it. They prefer music, shall we say, of a somewhat lesser quality. Well, that's getting into another one of my monologues that I'll give in the future about the decline of aesthetics. But what happens in a democracy is, think about it, who is king in a democracy? It's not some higher class person. I don't mean nouveau riche here, the newer rich that might not have a high cultural level. I mean the people who really have high standards of language and in music and in dress and whatever. No, the cultural icons of democracies are maybe the rock groups. They have holes in their pants and they sing songs about abusing women and such things. In other words, as much as I love democracy, you have to recognize that the tendency in a democracy is not striving upwards. It's striving to be another one of the common people, the common man as king. And for language consciousness, increasing vocabulary, perfecting one's style, this is really not such a good thing. Some of you might differ with me on that point. I'll get into that in a future talk. I see the tendency very strongly. And of course, as wonderful a concept as democracy is, and I really do love democracy, there's a downside to everything if you look at things closely. You gain on one hand and you lose on the other. Getting back now to jealousy and envy, I want to go into that a bit more deeply. Because remember, in the path of Socrates, we don't stop at the surface of things. We want to delve into things more. I could probably talk about jealousy and envy, and maybe if you dedicating some thought to it, could think about it also for hours. We're not going to do that, not by any means. But if we look at those two things, it's kind of interesting. Have you ever felt jealousy? And I don't mean your friend wins the lottery and you're jealous. No, that's envy. That's not jealousy. I mean, for example, in love, that's the most obvious thing. You might have a love interest, but then you notice that he or she is not dedicating so much time to you and they're flirting with somebody else, and you feel this onslaught of jealousy, right? Who hasn't experienced that, really? In later years, I largely got over that. And even when I was younger, I would think, well, if she's in with somebody else, what can you do? Let her go with somebody else. Nonetheless, I was young. Yes, I felt that. You think, oh, why is she flirting with her eyes with that other guy and that son of a da-da-da-da-da, and want to get into a fight or whatever. Of course, I experienced that. I think most people have. Well, what is that? You think you have somebody and you don't want to lose her or him, right? It could also be with other things. It could be with your lawnmower. You have a lawnmower and some neighbor that has a tendency of not giving things back to you, wants to borrow the lawnmower, and you don't want to give him the lawnmower. You're jealous of your lawnmower, right? You don't want to hand it over to him because you don't want to risk losing it, right? That is jealousy. Is that a good or a bad thing? Well, generally it's considered a bad thing. On the other hand, if you have reason to believe your neighbor is not going to give you back your lawnmower, and he's a moocher that always takes things from people and then give it back, and you have to maybe hound him every day to get your stuff back, then I think it's just reasonable not want to give him the lawnmower, personally. I don't consider that jealousy. On the other hand, when people are involved, and that's the usual context when we think about jealousy, you don't really own anybody. And so if your partner is becoming much more interested in somebody else, my philosophy is just let them go then. If they're more interested in that person, well, let them go, because you can't really own anybody, right? With envy, this is a trait that you see very often. Very often it surprised me, because in general I was never envious. I could be jealous. Look through Confessions here, right? But my view on that is that there's no sense in pretending to be perfect, because none of us are perfect. And any fault you have is not something that only you have. There have been millions of people with that same fault, so let's just be honest here. With envy, I've never been one to turn green with envy. If somebody else won the lottery, say if a friend of mine won the lottery, I wouldn't be thinking, oh, why didn't it happen to me? No, I thought, well, okay, it happened to him, and it's great because he's happy now. I can be happy with other people, and I don't care what it is. Perhaps if it's something that you would really like to do, I don't know, or some talent you have, and you notice somebody else is more talented than that. Yes, in the past, I guess maybe I felt a little envy, but immediately said, well, what sense does that make? With any talent you have, there's always be somebody better than you. So just be happy that somebody else has a nice talent. I don't know. A lot of people don't feel that way, but let's look a little more deeply at what envy is. Some people think they're envious. For example, once again, the friend wins the lottery, and you think, oh, why couldn't I win the lottery? That's not necessarily envy. That's not necessarily envy. For example, your friend gets a good job, better than yours, and you think, oh, I want a good job too. That's not necessarily envy. And please don't call it jealousy, because he has the good job. He could be jealous of his job. If, for example, you meet his boss and his boss seems favorably inclined to you, then he could be jealous of his job. He's afraid of losing his job to you who do not have it. Let's remember this distinction. Maybe you've noticed that I was an English teacher for years, because I was. But it's not for that reason, really, that I'm criticizing the non-distinction between jealousy and envy. It's because people really should do that for the sake of the language and for the sake of understanding situations better as well. That's what's more important, right? So, your friend gets a good job, a really good job. Two examples of how their friends who have lesser jobs might react. One of them thinks, boy, I wish I get a really good job too, but that's not necessarily envy. You're not saying, oh, I wish he didn't get it. I wish I got it instead. Why should he get it? No, then you're thinking ill of somebody. That is envy. That is the capital sin, the deadly sin, according to certain church traditions, of envy. In other words, wishing that he didn't get that, whatever it is, money, the beautiful girlfriend, whatever, but that you had it instead. In other words, wishing ill upon him. I wish he'd drop dead and then I could get the girl. Well, that's envy at its worst, right? But if you just think, wow, I wish I get a good job too, there's nothing wrong with that. He managed to get a really good job. What you could do is talk to him. How did you manage to get this really good job? Well, I spent 2 hours a day looking, and then I had, at least one interview every day. And you're thinking to yourself, oh, wow, I've been looking for a job, but I only go to one interview a week. Maybe I should follow his example. In other words, you can learn from his example. This is not envy. In other words, you can be happy that he got what he got, and you could follow his example to maybe also get a really good job, or the girlfriend you want, or winning the lottery. That's an exception, because since with that game they have 49 numbers, you pick 6 numbers out of 49. I don't know how popular that is in the States. I know you have variants of that in Europe. That's quite popular. Don't expect to follow in your friend's footsteps if he wins that lottery, the big prize, because the probability is only 1 in almost 14 million. So you could play until you're blue in the face. And even if it happened to a friend of yours, it's not going to happen to you in all likelihood. So think of making a lot of money in some other way, right? So even with envy, let's not mistake it. I've known people who might be especially devout in some religious way, and something good happens to a friend, and they say, wow, I wish that could happen to me too. And they say, oh, no, I don't want to be envious. And I say, well, look, you didn't look envious, really. You weren't wishing ill upon your friend. You weren't saying, I wish I got that instead of he. No, you were just saying you wished that could happen to you too, and that's really not envy. No sense in feeling guilty about it whatsoever. And with jealousy, yes, if it's the point that you have something and you think it's yours, but it isn't even yours, right? If it is one of your true possessions, I don't know, your TV set, and a friend wants to borrow it because he didn't have one, and okay, maybe you say, okay, yeah, sure, I'll lend it to you, but if he's not trustworthy, then I can understand why you wouldn't want to do it. That's not necessarily jealousy. My main point here in this is distinguish between jealousy and envy, to show what the difference is, to encourage you to practice differentiating. Is it a really big deal? I'll be honest, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. If you want to say, a girl, for example, says, oh, Sally got such a nice boyfriend, I'm so jealous. Well, there's nothing really ethically wrong in that, obviously. But you might want to consider using the proper words. I'm so envious. In other words, let's not let envy totally disappear from the vocabulary, because we might deceive ourselves and think, wow, isn't that great? When we're learning, for example, Germans have a word for envy, but we don't have envy. And you can deceive yourselves thinking, well, we're not envious. No, you're every bit as envious as any other people in the world. You just you just dumb down the language to the point that you've taken the word envy and envious out of the language. And as I said, I think it's good to distinguish in order to understand things better. So I will end here saying, let's bring envy back into the English language. But I will hastily add, let's not bring it back into consciousness. Let's not take up that sin. Let's practice not being envious. If somebody gets something that you don't have, don't feel spiteful toward them, but think, wow, how did they manage that? Maybe I could learn something by talking to them and finding out. Or maybe if I motivate myself more, I can improve my situation or get more things or better girlfriend, whatever. I could do that too. Let's not envy other people. Let's use them as good examples to follow in their footsteps and also to improve ourselves and to acquire the things that we'd like to have in life. With that, I leave you for today, wishing you a fine day or night wherever you are, and see you next time. Or should I say, I'll talk to you next time, because this is, after all, an audio podcast and not a video. In any case, bye for now and stay safe.